Some of the most heinous criminals have met their end inside execution chambers within the United States this year. From the evil Marian Bowman Jr. to serial killer Frank Athen Walls, today we look at every United States prisoner executed in 2025, a year that saw more prisoners executed in Florida than any other. Hey everyone, Will here, just wishing all of our subscribers, followers and viewers a very happy new year. We're publishing 2 new videos every week in 2026. I hope you enjoy the video. Number 47, Marian Bowman Jr. Marian Bowman Jr. was executed by lethal injection on January 31st, 2025 in South Carolina for the 2001 murder of 21-year-old Candy Martin. This marked the first execution in the United States in 2025 and the third in South Carolina since the state resumed executions after a 13-year hiatus. Bowman was convicted of shooting Martin twice, once in the chest and once in the head, before placing her body in the trunk of her car and setting it on fire. The prosecution argued that Martin owed Bowman money for drugs, and several witnesses testified that Bowman had threatened to kill her. One of these witnesses was Bowman's cousin, who was granted a plea deal in exchange for his testimony. Bowman maintained his innocence throughout the trial and his time on death row, suggesting that his cousin was the actual perpetrator. Bowman was 20 years old at the time of the crime, and his execution raised concerns about the application of the death penalty to young black men. Number 46, Steven Lawayne Nelson. On March 3rd, 2011, Nelson, along with 2 accomplices, entered North Point Baptist Church with the intent to rob the victims. Reverend Clint Dobson, 28, was bound and suffocated with a plastic bag, suffering blunt force trauma to his head, face, back, shoulder, arms and hands. Judy Elliott, the church secretary, sustained massive head trauma but survived. Nelson stole Dobson's laptop, Elliott's credit cards and her car, later using the credit cards for purchases. Elliott later identified Nelson as one of the perpetrators. Nelson was convicted of capital murder and attempted capital murder in 2012. He maintained that he was merely a lookout during the crime and that 2 others were responsible for Dobson's death. As an adult, he was arrested multiple times for offences including theft and burglary. While awaiting trial for Dobson's murder, Nelson allegedly murdered fellow inmate Jonathan Holden in 2012, though he was never tried for that charge. On the day of his execution, Nelson spent time with his wife Helena Noah Dubois and expressed his readiness for death. Number 45, Demetrius Terrence Frasier. Convicted for the murder of 40-year-old Pauline Brown, Frasier confessed to Brown's murder after his arrest in Detroit, Michigan, for the 1992 murder of 14-year-old Crystal Kendrick. Besides his 2 murder convictions, Frasier was suspected of attacking 8 other women in Michigan and was tried and found guilty of 2 of those attacks by a Wayne County jury. For the murder of Brown, Frasier was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death in Alabama in 1996. He was also given multiple life sentences in 1993 for the murder of Kendrick and other offences he committed in Michigan. He spent over 18 years at the Alger Correctional Facility in Michigan until 2011, when he was transferred to the Holman Correctional Facility in Alabama, home to the state's death row. Frasier was executed by nitrogen hypoxia on February 6, 2025, after being imprisoned for over 32 years. He was the 4th person in the United States to be executed using this method. Number 44, James Dennis Ford. Convicted for the brutal 1997 murders of Gregory and Kimberly Malnery in Charlotte County, Florida, Ford, a co-worker of Gregory Malnery, lured the couple to a remote sod farm under the pretense of a fishing trip. There he murdered the couple, a crime crime he was convicted for in 1999, receiving 2 death sentences for the murders. His appeals, including claims of intellectual disability, were denied, with the US Supreme Court rejecting his final appeal. At age 64, Ford was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison, marking the state's first execution of 2025. He declined to make a final statement but left a written note expressing love and prayers. The victim's daughter, Miranda Malnori, expressed that while the execution brought some peace, it could not erase the lifelong pain of losing her parents. Number 43, Richard Lee Tabler. Tabler lured the 2 men to a remote location under the pretense of selling stereo equipment and then fatally shot them. He later confessed to killing 2 teenage girls, Tiffany Dotson and Amanda Benefield, who worked at the same strip club as Rahamuni. Although he was indicted for these additional murders, he was never tried for them. In 2008, while on death row, Tabler used a smuggled cell phone to make threatening calls to a Texas state senator, prompting a statewide prison lockdown and a crackdown on contraband. During his nearly 2 decades on death row, Tabler expressed remorse for his actions and engaged in religious activities, including writing books and mentoring fellow inmates. In his final statement before execution, he apologized to the victims' families and sought their forgiveness. Tabler was pronounced dead at 6:38 p.m. after receiving a lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. Number 42, Brad Keith Sigman. On April 27, 2001, Sigman murdered his ex-girlfriend's parents, David and Gladys Lark, in their Greenville County home a week after his relationship with their daughter ended. Following the murders, Sigman kidnapped his ex-girlfriend at gunpoint, though she later escaped, and in July 2002, Sigman was convicted on 2 counts of murder and 1 count of first-degree burglary. He received 2 death sentences and a 30-year prison term for the burglary. His appeals were repeatedly denied, culminating in the US Supreme Court rejecting his final appeal in January 2021. Brad Keith Sigman was executed by firing squad on March 7th, 2025 at the Broad River Correctional Institution in Columbia, South Carolina. His execution marked the first use of this method in the United States since 2010 and the first in South Carolina's modern history. During the execution, Sigman was strapped into a chair with a target placed over his heart, with 3 volunteer prison employees simultaneously fired rifles loaded with bullets designed to shatter on impact. Sigman was pronounced dead at 6:08 p.m., becoming the oldest person executed in the state at the age of 67. Number 41, Jesse Dean Hoffman Jr. On November 26, 1996, Hoffman, then 18 years old and employed as a valet at a New Orleans parking garage, abducted Elliot at gunpoint as she retrieved her car. He forced her to withdraw $200 from an ATM and then drove her to a remote area in St. Tammany Parish and executed her. Elliot's body was discovered 2 days later by a duck hunter. Hoffman was arrested after ATM surveillance footage linked him to the crime. He initially denied involvement but later confessed. Hoffman was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death on September 11, 1998. Over the years he filed multiple appeals, all of which were denied. On March 18, 2025, Hoffman was executed at the Louisiana State Penitentiary. He declared a final meal and chose not to make a final statement. Number 40, Aaron Brian Gunches. On November 14, 2002, Gunches abducted Ted Price from a residence in Mesa, Arizona. He and an accomplice drove Price into the desert off the Beeline Highway, where Gunches shot him 4 times. The motive was reportedly linked to a domestic dispute involving Gunches' girlfriend and Price. However, in January 2003, Gunches shot and wounded an Arizona Department of Public Safety officer during a traffic stop. The officer survived due to his bulletproof vest, and Gunches was apprehended the following day after a manhunt, pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in 2007, and was sentenced to death in 2008. On March 19, 2025, Gunches was executed by lethal injection. He was pronounced dead at 10:33 a.m. He declined to make a final statement. His execution marked Arizona's first since 2022 and the first under Governor Katie Hobbs. Number 39, Wendel Arden Grissom. In November 2005, Grissom, then 36, and a hitchhiker named Jesse Floyd Johns randomly selected a home near Watonga, Oklahoma to rob. Inside were Drew Kopf, her 2 young daughters, and her friend Amber Dawn Matthews, 23. Grissom shot Kopf multiple times, leaving her severely wounded. Matthews, holding one of the children, fled to a bedroom but was pursued by Grissom and killed, but the children were left unharmed. Grissom and Johns were apprehended shortly after the crime. Grissom was convicted of first-degree murder and other charges in 2008 and sentenced to death, while Johns received a life sentence without parole. Grissom was pronounced dead at 10:13 a.m. In his final words, he expressed remorse, stating, "I apologize to all of you that I've hurt. I regret so much that I've put that hatred in your heart for me." Number 38, Edward Thomas James. On September 19th, 1993, James, who was renting a room in Betty Dick's home, returned after a night of heavy drinking and drug use. After attacking 8-year-old Toni Neuner and murdering her grandmother, James stole Dick's jewellery and car and fled the state. The case gained national attention when it was featured on America's Most Wanted, leading to James's arrest in Bakersfield, California on October 6th, 1993. In 1995, James pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder and other charges, including aggravated child abuse, and was sentenced to death based on an 11-to-1 jury recommendation. James was executed by lethal injection on March 20th, 2025 at Florida State Prison in Rayford, was pronounced dead at 8:15 p.m. and had no visitors on the day of his execution and declined to make a final statement. Number 37, Mikall Anthony Tanzi. On April 25th, 2000, while Acosta was on her lunch break in Miami, Tanzi approached her parked van, requested the time and a cigarette, then attacked her. He threatened her with a razor blade, forced her to drive to Homestead, Florida, and later to the Florida Keys, used her bank card to withdraw money, and then murdered her. Tanzi was arrested shortly after the crime and confessed to the murder, leading authorities to Acosta's body. In 2003, he was convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, carjacking, and armed robbery. The jury unanimously recommended the death penalty, and he was sentenced accordingly. Despite last-minute appeals, the execution proceeded as planned. Tanzi was pronounced dead at 6:12 p.m., with him apologizing to Acosta's family and recited a Bible verse out loud. Number 36, Mikall Dean Mahdi. Over a 3-day period in July 2004, Mahdi embarked on a multi-state crime spree across Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. He allegedly began by killing Greg Jones in Virginia, though he was never tried for this crime. On July 15, 2004, Mahdi robbed and fatally shot 29-year-old convenience store clerk Christopher Jason Boggs in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. 2 days later, he murdered 56-year-old off-duty police captain James Myers in Calhoun County, South Carolina, shooting him 9 times with his own service weapon. Mahdi then stole Myers' truck and fled to Florida, where he was apprehended on July 21st, 2004. Mahdi was convicted of multiple crimes across 3 states, including first-degree murder, second-degree burglary, and grand larceny. In South Carolina, he was sentenced to death for the murder of Captain Myers. Despite appeals citing ineffective counsel and a traumatic childhood, the South Carolina Supreme Court denied his final appeal on April 7th, 2025. On April 11th, 2025, Mahdi was executed by firing squad at the Broad River Correctional Institution in Columbia, South Carolina. He chose this method over lethal injection or electrocution, expressing concerns about the potential pain associated with the other options. Number 35, Moises Sandoval Mendoza. On March 18, 2004, Mendoza, then 20 years old, abducted Tolleson from her home, leaving her 6-month-old daughter alone, and attacked her. Mendoza confessed to the crime after being arrested and led investigators to Tolleson's body before, in 2005, he was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. His appeals, including claims of ineffective legal representation and a request for clemency based on his age at the time of the crime, were denied. Mendoza was pronounced dead at 6 p.m. His execution was the 3rd in Texas and the 13th in the United States in 2025. Number 34, James Lee Osgood. On October 18, 2010, Tracy Brown failed to show up for work, prompting concern from her employer. Her body was discovered later that day in her home. Investigators determined that Brown had been murdered by Osgood and his girlfriend Tonya Van Dyke, who was also Brown's cousin. The couple had acted on a shared fantasy of kidnapping, leading to Brown's brutal death. In 2014, Osgood was convicted of 2 counts of capital murder, with the jury unanimously recommended the death penalty, and the trial court accepted that recommendation. Osgood was pronounced dead at 6:35 p.m. on April 24, 2025, following a 3-drug injection. His execution was the 2nd in Alabama and the 14th in the United States in 2025. Number 33, Jeffrey Glenn Hutchinson. On September 11, 1998, Hutchinson fatally shot his 32-year-old girlfriend, Renee Flaherty, and her 3 children, Jeffrey, Amanda, and Logan, in their Crestview, Florida home. The murders occurred following an argument between Hutchinson and Flaherty. After leaving the house and consuming alcohol at a bar, Hutchinson returned home and used a 12-gauge shotgun to kill Flaherty and the children. He then called 911 stating, "I just shot my family." Police found Hutchinson in the garage with the phone still connected, gunshot residue on his hands, and tissue from one of the victims on his leg. In 2001, Hutchinson was convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder. He received a life sentence for Flaherty's murder and death sentences for each of the children's murders. Hutchinson's execution was carried out at 8:15 p.m. on May 1st, 2025. He did not make a final statement but appeared to be mumbling to himself as the procedure began, and the process took a little more than 15 minutes. Number 32, Glenn Edward Rogers. Rogers was convicted of 2 murders committed in 1995 with Tina Marie Cribbs, who Rogers met at a bar in Gibsonton, and Sandra Gallagher, whom he had met at a bar in Van Nuys. While Rogers claimed responsibility for up to 70 murders, he was only officially convicted of these 2, but he was also suspected in several other homicides across the United States. Rogers was sentenced to death in Florida in 1997 for Cribbs' murder and received another death sentence in California in 1999 for Gallagher's murder. On May 15, 2025, Rogers was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. He was pronounced dead at 6:16 p.m. His final meal consisted of pizza, chocolate cake, and a soda. In his final moments, he reportedly made a statement expressing support for President Donald Trump. Number 31, Benjamin Donnie Ritchie. On September 29th in the year 2000, Ritchie, then 20 years old, was involved in the theft of a van in Beech Grove, Indiana. After a police pursuit, Officer Tony chased Ritchie on foot. During the chase, Ritchie fired 4 shots, hitting Tony just above his bulletproof vest. Tony, a 31-year-old husband and father of 2, died shortly before his birthday. Ritchie was convicted in 2002 of murder, burglary, auto theft, unlawful possession of a firearm, and resisting arrest. He was sentenced to death on October 15, 2002. His appeals, including claims of ineffective legal representation and mental health issues stemming from fetal alcohol spectrum disorders and childhood lead exposure, torture were denied by both state and federal courts. He was pronounced dead at 12:46 a.m. on May 20th, 2025. His last meal was the tour of Italy from Olive Garden, and his final words were, "I love my family, my friends, and all the support I've gotten. I hope they all find peace." Number 30, Matthew Lee Johnson. On May 20th, 2012, Johnson entered a convenience store in Garland where Harris, a great-grandmother, was working. He forced her to open the cash register, stealing money, her rings, a lighter, 2 packs of cigarettes, and a bag of candy before attacking her. Despite her severe injuries, Harris managed to describe her attacker to the police before succumbing to her wounds 5 days later. Johnson was arrested shortly after the crime and, during his 2013 trial, admitted to the attack on Harris. He claimed he was under the influence of crack cocaine at the time and did not intend to harm her, though he accepted responsibility for his actions. The jury convicted him of capital murder and he was sentenced to death, and over the years Johnson's legal team filed multiple appeals, citing his history of drug addiction and childhood abuse, with all failing. Johnson's execution was carried out exactly 13 years after the crime, a date reportedly requested by Harris's family. He was pronounced dead at 6:53 p.m. Number 29, Oscar Franklin Smith. On October 1st, 1989, in Nashville, Tennessee, Smith murdered his estranged wife, Judith Robird Smith, and her 2 teenage sons, Chad and Jason Burnett. A 911 call made by Jason reportedly captured the words, "Frank, no, God help me," referring to Smith's middle name. Smith was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder in 1990 and sentenced to death. He filed multiple appeals, including claims of innocence and challenges to the state's execution methods. In 2022, his execution was postponed due to issues with lethal injection protocols. However, on May 22, 2025, Smith was executed by lethal injection at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville. He was pronounced dead at 10:47 a.m. Despite maintaining his innocence until the end, stating, "I didn't kill her," the execution proceeded as scheduled, ending a 3-year moratorium on executions in Tennessee. Number 28, Anthony Floyd Wainwright. Wainwright's crime spree began after he and an accomplice, Richard Hamilton, escaped from a prison in North Carolina. They stole guns and a Cadillac, eventually driving to Florida. When their stolen vehicle overheated, they targeted Carmen Gayhart, a 23-year-old nursing student and mother of 2. As she loaded groceries into her Ford Bronco at a Winn-Dixie supermarket, they abducted her at gunpoint. They drove the stolen Bronco north on I-75 to a wooded area in Hamilton County and strangled Gayhart before shooting her. Wainwright was convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, robbery, and sexual battery, with a jury unanimously recommended the death penalty. Wainwright was executed by lethal injection at the Florida State Prison in Rayford on Tuesday, June 10, 2025, and declined his last meal, with his execution marking the 6th carried out in Florida during 2025. Number 27, Gregory Hunt. On August 2nd, 1988, in Cook Springs, Alabama, Hunt broke into the apartment that Karen Leane shared with another woman. Prosecutors detailed that Hunt, enraged by jealousy, attacked Leane and caused her over 60 injuries. Hunt was indicted on 3 capital counts, including intentional murder during the course of a burglary and intentional murder, and the jury recommended the death penalty by a vote of 11-1. Gregory Hunt was executed on Tuesday, June 10, 2025, at the William C. Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama. Number 26, John Fitzgerald Hansen. Also known as George John Hansen, this Oklahoma death row inmate was convicted of a violent crime spree involving his accomplice Victor Miller. On August 31, 1999, Hansen and Miller abducted Mary Agnes Bowles, a 77-year-old retired banker from the Promenade Mall in Tulsa, Oklahoma. They carjacked her vehicle with the intent to use it for other robberies. The pair drove Bowles to a secluded dirt pit near Owasso. There they encountered Gerald Thurman, the 44-year-old owner of the property. Miller shot Thurman, who later died from his injuries. Hansen then took Bowles into the woods and shot her multiple times, killing her. Hansen was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death for the killing of Mary Bowles. He received a sentence of life without parole for his role in the death of Gerald Thurman. His execution was delayed due to jurisdictional disputes. However, Hansen was executed by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAllister on Thursday, June 12, 2025. Number 25. Stephen Christopher Stanko. Stanko's crimes took place over the course of a single day in the Horry and Georgetown counties of South Carolina. Stanko strangled his 43-year-old girlfriend, Laura Elizabeth Ling, to death inside their Murrells Inlet home, and during the same incident he attacked and attempted to murder Ling's teenage daughter. After the attack on Ling and her daughter, Stanko drove to the Conway home of his friend, Henry Lee Turner, shot and killed him while he was shaving, and then stole Turner's truck. Stanko was tried in 2 separate cases. He received a death sentence in 2006 for Ling's murder and related crimes, and a second death sentence in 2009 for Turner's murder. Stephen Christopher Stanko was executed by lethal injection at the Broad River Correctional Institution in Columbia, South Carolina, for the murder of Henry Lee Turner on Friday, June 13, 2025. Number 24. Thomas Lee Gudinas. Convicted for the killing of Michelle McGrath in May 1994, McGrath was last seen at a downtown Orlando bar called Barbarella's shortly before 3 a.m. on May 24, 1994. Gudinas was convicted of first-degree murder, attempted burglary with an assault and battery after another woman identified Gudinas as the man who had chased her to her car and threatened to assault her. A school employee who found McGrath's body identified Gudinas as a man fleeing the area shortly before the body was discovered. Gudinas was convicted in 1995. The jury recommended the death sentence by a vote of 10-2, and Gudinas was executed by lethal injection at the Florida State Prison near Stark on Tuesday, June 24, 2025. Number 23. Richard Gerald Jordan. Jordan, who was unemployed, devised a plot to kidnap the relative of a bank executive. He called the Gulf National Bank in Gulfport, identified commercial loan officer Charles Chuck Martyr, and used a phone directory to find his address. On January 12, 1976, Jordan drove to the home posing as an electric company worker who needed to check the circuit breakers. Once inside, he kidnapped Edwina Martyr, the 34-year-old wife of the bank executive. After the killing, Jordan called Chuck Martyr and demanded a ransom of between $25,000 and $50,000 while falsely claiming Edwina was still alive. Jordan was first convicted of capital murder in 1976. Due to changes in constitutional law concerning automatic death sentences, he was resentenced to death 4 times over the decades. Richard Gerald Jordan was executed by lethal injection at the Mississippi State Penitentiary on Wednesday, June 25, 2025. Number 22. Michael Bernard Bell. An attempted revenge killing. Bell's brother had been fatally shot earlier that year by a man named Theodore Wright in what was ruled self-defense. Bell had other plans and told family and friends he intended to kill Wright. Bell spotted a car he believed belonged to Wright outside a liquor lounge. However, Bell was unaware that Wright had recently sold the car to Jimmy West, Wright's half-brother. Bell, armed with an AK-47 rifle and accompanied by 2 friends, waited for the vehicle's owner. When Jimmy West, Tameka Smith and another woman exited the club and got into the car, Bell approached and opened fire. Jimmy West died at the scene and Smith succumbed to her injuries on the way to the hospital, while witnesses reported that Bell also fired at a crowd of onlookers outside the bar before fleeing the area. Court records indicate Bell was also later convicted of 3 additional murders that occurred before the 1993 shooting, including a woman and her 2-year-old toddler. Bell was convicted in 1995 and sentenced to death for the murders of Jimmy West and Tameka Smith, and was executed at the Florida State Prison near Stark on Tuesday, July 15, 2025. Number 21, Edward James Zakrzewski II. Convicted of triple murder, Zakrzewski II was a US Air Force technical sergeant who committed the murders after his wife Sylvia sought a divorce. The attacks were premeditated and brutal, with Zakrzewski bringing a machete to work during his lunch break and hiding it in the bathroom. Upon his family's return, he first attacked Sylvia, hitting her repeatedly with a crowbar in the living room before attacking his son and daughter. He pled guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder in 1996, and was automatically sentenced to death, which happened at the Florida State Prison on Thursday, July 31st, 2025. He requested a last meal which included fried pork chops, fried onions, potatoes, bacon, toast, root beer, ice cream and pie. Number 20, Byron Lewis Black. Known as the Clay family murders, Black's crimes occurred on March 28, 1988 in Nashville, Tennessee, and included Black's girlfriend Angela Clay, Angela's daughter LaToya, and her other daughter Lakeisha. Black, who was Angela Clay's boyfriend, was on work release at the time, serving a 2-year sentence for a prior felony in which he had shot and wounded Angela's estranged husband, Benny Clay, in 1986. While temporarily released, Black entered Angela's home and killed all 3 inhabitants, with Black later giving inconsistent statements about the location of the weapon and his whereabouts. Black was convicted of 3 charges of first-degree murder in 1989. The jury sentenced him to death for the murder of Lakeisha Clay and 2 consecutive life sentences for the murders of Angela and LaToya Clay. Black spent 36 years on death row before being executed on Tuesday, August 5, 2025 at the Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville, Tennessee. Number 19, Cale Barrington Bates. Bates, who had worked as a delivery man and made a previous stop at the office, broke into a building while Janet Renee White was out to lunch and waited for her to return. When White returned, she spotted Bates and let out a bone-chilling scream before White attacked and overpowered her, forcing her from the office into the woods behind the building. Bates was apprehended near the scene about 20 minutes after the attack began and had the victim's ring in his pocket, which had been torn from her finger. Bates was originally convicted and sentenced to death in 1983. His case had a long history of appeals, resulting in multiple resentencing hearings. Bates was executed at the Florida State Prison under a death warrant signed by Governor Ron DeSantis on Tuesday, August 19, 2025, and was pronounced dead at 6:17 p.m. Number 18, Curtis Lee Windham. Windham's capital convictions stem from a shooting spree on February 7, 1992 in Orange County, Florida. The crimes were motivated by both a debt and personal relationship. Windham claimed Johnny Lee owed him $2,000. After learning Lee had won $114 at a Greyhound racetrack, Windham told a friend, "You're gonna read about me," and stated he planned to kill Lee. Windham bought a .38 caliber revolver and ammunition. He drove up to where Lee was standing on a sidewalk, shot him twice in the back from his car, and then got out and shot Lee twice more at close range as he lay on the ground. He then attacked Windham's on-again, off-again girlfriend and the mother of one of his children before the attempted murder of Kenneth Williams, whom he shot on the street. His third murder was that of Valerie Davis's mother, Mary Lubin, whose car he saw stopped at a stop sign near the apartment before shooting her twice, fatally. Windham was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted first-degree murder, with the death penalty automatically recommended. Curtis Windham was executed at the Florida State Prison on Thursday, August 28, 2025, with his execution marking a record number of executions in the state's modern era. Number 17, David Joseph Pittman. Pittman's capital convictions stemmed from a single attack on the family of his estranged wife, Marie, with whom he was going through a contentious divorce. According to a jailhouse informant's testimony, Pittman gained entry to the home and first killed Bonnie Knowles by stabbing her after she refused his advances and began to cry out. Pittman first cut the phone line at the home to prevent calls for help, and then killed Barbara Knowles in the hallway, and finally killed Clarence Knowles in the living room as Clarence tried to use the cut phone. After the stabbings, Pittman set the house on fire and stole Bonnie Knowles' car. He later abandoned the vehicle and set it ablaze as well. Pittman was found guilty in 1991 of 3 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of arson, and 1 count of grand theft auto, late robbing sentenced to death. Pittman was executed at the Florida State Prison on Wednesday, September 17, 2025, after the U.S. Supreme Court rejected his final appeal. Number 16, Jeffrey Todd West. Convicted for the 1997 murder of a convenience store clerk during a robbery, Jeffrey Todd West, who was 21 at the time and had previously worked at the same Chevron station, went there with his girlfriend with the intent to rob the store because they were desperate for cash. West shot Margaret Parrish Berry in the back of the head while she was lying on the floor behind the counter, while approximately $250 was taken from a cookie can that held the station's money. West was convicted of capital murder in the course of a robbery, while his girlfriend was charged and later pleaded guilty, receiving a 35-year sentence. In 1999, the jury voted 10-2 to recommend the death sentence, which the judge adopted, and this was carried out on Thursday, September 25, 2025, using the fairly controversial method of nitrogen hypoxia. Number 15, Blaine Keith Milam. Responsible for the brutal 2008 murder of his 13-month-old stepdaughter Amora Carson, Milam called 911 from the trailer he shared with Jessica Carson in Rusk County, Texas, claiming he found her dead. In reality, the cause of death was homicidal violence due to multiple blunt force injuries, with Milam and Jessica Carson initially giving police inconsistent explanations. They claimed the injuries occurred during an exorcism they performed to expel a demon from the child, which police later found out was a cover-up for the beating. Milam was convicted of capital murder in 2010, sentenced to death, and spent 15 years on death row with appeals, which led to stays in 2019 and 2021. His life ended at the Huntsville unit in Huntsville in Texas on Thursday, September 25, 2025, at the age of 35, where he was pronounced dead at 6:40 p.m. Number 14, Victor Tony Jones. Victor Tony Jones was convicted of the murders of his employers, Matilda Dolly Nestor and her husband Jacob Jack Nestor, who owned the Nestor Engineering Company in Miami-Dade County. The crime occurred on December 19, 1990, and Jones had only been working at the company for 2 days before he fatally stabbed both victims during an attempted armed robbery. Before succumbing to his injury, Jacob Nestor managed to retrieve a .22 caliber pistol from his office and fired 5 times at Jones, striking him once in the forehead. Jones was convicted in March 1993 on 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of armed robbery, along with a charge for possession of a firearm by a convicted felon. The jury recommended the death penalty, and Jones was executed at the Florida State Prison in Rayford on Tuesday, September 30th, 2025. Number 13, Roy Lee Ward. Convicted for the brutal 2001 murder of 15-year-old Stacey Payne, Ward's crime occurred on July 11, 2001, in the victim's home in the small community of Dale, Spencer County, Indiana. He approached the Payne residence under the pretense of looking for a lost dog, convincing Stacey to let him inside the house. Payne, a high school student and cheerleader who was waiting to go to her part-time job, was attacked and suffered fatal injuries. Ward was apprehended at the scene after Stacey's younger sister Melissa awoke to Stacey's screams and saw a man lying on top of her from the top of the stairs before calling 911. First convicted and sentenced to death in 2002, this was overturned in 2004 and a new trial with the same outcome took place in Clay County, with his sentence affirmed on appeal. He was executed on Friday, October 10th, 2025 at Indiana State Prison shortly after midnight. He was pronounced dead at 12:33 a.m. Number 12, Samuel Lee Smithers. Smithers was a deacon at a Baptist church and was married but led a double life, regularly soliciting sex workers in Tampa. He met both his victims at a Tampa motel on different dates in May 1996. He drove the women to the secluded 27-acre property near Plant City where he worked, which included 3 ponds. Court records indicate a dispute arose between himself and his first victim, leading Smithers to kill her in a garage at the property. 1 to 2 weeks later, Smithers murdered Christy Cowan, who he met at the same property. However, the property owner, who knew Smithers from church, became suspicious after seeing Smithers cleaning an axe in the carport. Smithers later admitted to the murders after failing a polygraph test and was also named the prime suspect in the 1989 unsolved murder of Marcel Delano, another sex worker, but he was never convicted of that crime. Samuel Lee Smithers was executed at the Florida State Prison on Tuesday, October 14th, 2025, at the age of 72. He was the oldest person executed in Florida since the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976. Number 11, Lance Collins. On November 26, 2004, Shockley was involved in a car accident near Van Buren, Missouri, while driving his sister-in-law's fiancée's truck. The accident resulted in the death of the passenger Jeffrey Bayless, and Shockley fled the scene. Sergeant Graham was the trooper heading the investigation into the fatal hit-and-run, and Shockley was named a suspect. On March 20, 2005, Shockley waited for hours near Graham's home in Carter County when Sergeant Graham returned home from his patrol shift and was exiting his patrol vehicle. Shockley fatally shot him with a high-powered rifle. Shockley was arrested 3 days later in connection with the hit-and-run and subsequently charged with Graham's murder and sentenced to death after the judge ruled over the jury, which was deadlocked. Lance Shockley was executed at the Eastern Reception Diagnostic and Correctional Center in Bonne Terre, Missouri on October 14, 2025 at the age of 48. Number 10, Charles Ray Crawford. Convicted of the first-degree murder of Thelma Grant, who was killed during a burglary at her home in Oklahoma City, Crawford and an accomplice, Kenneth Smith, broke into Grant's home with the intent to rob her. The robbers stole Grant's purse, which contained approximately $130, and other items from the home, with Crawford later linked to the crime by DNA evidence found at the scene. His accomplice, Kenneth Smith, was later arrested and confessed, implicating Crawford as the one who struck the victim. Smith testified against Crawford in exchange for a plea deal that resulted in a life sentence. Crawford was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death in 2002. The jury found 2 aggravating circumstances. The murder was committed for the purpose of avoiding lawful arrest, and it was committed during the commission of a robbery. Charles Ray Crawford was executed at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester on Thursday, October 23, 2025, with his last meal consisting of a ribeye steak, a baked potato with sour cream, 2 fried eggs, 2 pieces of toast, and orange juice. Number 9, Richard Kenneth Yerf. Convicted of the murders of Julie L. Williams and Tracy S. Jones, 2 British tourists who were staying in Florida, the 2 women were last seen in the Orlando area in June 1990. Yerf, who was a local truck driver and convicted felon, encountered the women at a bar and offered to show them an authentic side of Florida, inviting them to visit his remote home near Apopka, Florida. After they arrived at his home, Yerf attacked the women, then hid their bodies in a septic tank on his property, and the women were reported missing after they failed to check out of their hotel. Yerf was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder in 1991. The jury recommended the death penalty on a 9-3 vote, and he was executed at Florida State Prison on Wednesday, November 5, 2025, at the age of 60, having spent 34 years on death row. Number 8, Anthony Todd Boyd. Convicted for his role in the 1993 kidnapping and murder of Gregory New York Hughley, Boyd was one of 4 men who participated in the fatal attack that took place in Talladega County, Alabama. Prosecutors argued the motive was a $200 debt Hughley owed for cocaine, and court filings indicate the men abducted Hughley. Boyd was convicted in 1995 of capital murder during a kidnapping and was 21 years old at the time of the crime, having no significant prior criminal history. The jury recommended the death penalty by a non-unanimous 10-2 vote. This non-unanimous verdict would have prevented a death sentence in nearly every other state. Boyd consistently maintained his innocence for the 3 decades he spent on death row, with the conviction based solely on the eyewitness testimony of a co-defendant who received a plea deal. Forensic evidence did not match Boyd's fingerprints, and the state medical examiner testified there was no physical evidence tying Boyd to the scene. Boyd was executed at Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama, on Thursday, October 23, 2025, using nitrogen hypoxia. Number 7. Norman Meal Grimm Jr., a Florida inmate convicted for the 1998 murder and sexual battery of his next-door neighbor Cynthia Campbell. Grimm waived his final appeals and actively sought his execution rather than pursuing further legal action. On the morning of July 27, 1998, Campbell called the police after a lug nut was thrown through her window. Grimm, her neighbour, came over to check on the incident. After the police left, Grimm invited Campbell over to his house for a cup of coffee, but once inside or shortly thereafter, Grimm attacked Campbell, who was subjected to a brutal assault. Grimm was on parole at the time of the crime, having been convicted of several violent felonies in the 1980s, including unarmed robbery, kidnapping and robbery, and armed burglary and aggravated battery. Grimm was found guilty of first-degree murder and battery by a jury in 2000 after Grimm refused to let his lawyers present any mitigating evidence, and the jury ultimately unanimously recommended the death penalty. Grimm was executed at the Florida State Prison on Tuesday, October 28, 2025, and was pronounced dead at 6:14 p.m, with his last meal consisting of fried pork chops and mashed potatoes with a chocolate milkshake and pie. Number 6. Brian Frederick Jennings. Jennings was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder for the premeditated killing of his children in a rural area of Hernando County, Florida. The murders were driven by a desire to prevent his estranged wife, Debbie Jennings, from gaining custody of the children during their ongoing divorce and custody battle. After the murders, Jennings drove to his workplace, called his wife to inform her that he had killed their sons, and then called 911. He confessed to the murders immediately upon his arrest. The case proceeded to the penalty phase after his guilty plea, where the jury unanimously recommended the death penalty by a vote of 12-0. Jennings was executed at the Florida State Prison on Thursday, November 20th, 2025, using the state's 3-drug protocol for lethal injection. His last meal included fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, coleslaw, and a chocolate cake with frosting. Number 5. Stephen Corey Bryant. On October 16, 1998, Bryant and his cousin Keith Clay entered a convenience store late at night with the intent to commit a robbery. During the robbery, Bryant shot Vietnamese immigrant and mother of 2 Nguyen once in the chest at close range. The attack was witnessed by 2 customers who were present in the store. Bryant and Clay then fled the scene with the cash register drawer, and Bryant was arrested 2 days later and convicted of capital murder. Bryant was sentenced to death in 2000, spent over 2 decades on death row, and his final appeals were denied by the U.S. Supreme Court. Bryant was executed at the Huntsville unit in Huntsville, Texas, on Wednesday, November 12, 2025, with a single massive dose of the sedative pentobarbital. Number 4. Richard Barry Randolph. Convicted of the 1988 murder and armed robbery of his former manager, Minnie Ruth McCollum, at a convenience store in Palatka, Florida, Randolph had previously been employed at the store. Randolph planned to break into the store safe to steal money. He had reportedly been spotted by 3 women wearing a handyway smock as he locked the store's front door shortly after 7 a.m. Randolph was spotted by McCollum while attempting to access the safe, and a struggle ensued. Court records show that Randolph brutally then attacked his victim, admitting he had staged the scene to make it look like a maniac attacker. After the attack, Randolph took the woman's car keys and left the store, with a deputy responding to the scene after witnesses reported the store locked and in disarray. Randolph was arrested shortly after the attack at a grocery store in Jacksonville while trying to cash in stolen lottery tickets from the convenience store, and admitted to the attack. Randolph spent 36 years on death row and was executed at the Florida State Prison on Thursday, November 20th, 2025, after the US Supreme Court denied all final appeals. Number 3. Mark Allen Geralds. On the 2nd of January 1989, the 8-year-old son of Tressa and Kevin Pettibone found his mother beaten and stabbed to death on the kitchen floor. Tressa Pettibone had 2 stab wounds on the right side of her neck and 1 fatal stab wound on the left side. These stab wounds were consistent with a knife found in the kitchen sink. A number of items were missing from the home, including the victim's car, and police soon discovered that Mark Allen Geralds, a carpenter, had been helping remodel the Pettibones' home. A considerable amount of circumstantial evidence connected Geralds to the crime, including the fact that he knew Kevin Pettibone was out of town at the time of the crime and asked Tressa Pettibone and the children when Mr. Pettibone would be returning. Geralds pawned jewellery from the Pettibone home that had traces of blood that were consistent with Tressa Pettibone's blood type, and he gave the victim's sunglasses to a friend. Having an extensive criminal record at the time of the offence, he had been in and out of the Florida Department of Corrections since January 1983 and picked up robbery and weapons charges. He was indicted and found guilty of murder, armed robbery, burglary and grand theft auto, with a verdict of guilty being returned by the jury, and the jury recommending a death sentence by a vote of 8-4. In the state's 18th execution in 2025, Geralds was pronounced dead at 6:15 p.m. following a 3-drug injection at Florida State Prison, with his passing taking around 4 minutes. Number 2. Harold Wayne Nichols. The first person to be executed after pleading guilty to a murder since Tennessee reenacted the death penalty in 1978, Harold Wayne Nichols confessed to the murder of Karen Pulley, a 20-year-old student at Chattanooga State University. Pulley, who was 20 when she was killed, had just finished Bible school and was attending college in Chattanooga to become a paralegal. He also confessed to attacking several other women in the area and said he would have continued his criminal behaviour had he not been arrested and placed in jail, admitting remorse at trial. The US Supreme Court declined to issue a stay of the execution for the crimes, and Nichols was executed by lethal injection at the Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville, Tennessee. Number 1. Frank Athen Walls. Walls' confirmed crimes span over 2 years, characterised by extreme brutality, with this infamous American serial killer committing a violent spree that claimed the lives of 5 individuals between 1985 and 1987. The victims of his crimes included 19-year-old Tommy Lou Whidden, attacked as Walls stole her car on March 26, 1985, and 24-year-old Cynthia Sue Condra, who was stabbed 21 times on September 16, 1986. Next, Walls broke into the home of 47-year-old Audrey Geige on May 20, 1987, before attacking her and leaving DNA evidence behind at the crime scene, something that would later help in his capture. On July 22, 1987, Edward Algerand and Anne Louise Peterson, both in their early 20s, were attacked in their mobile home after Walls broke in and tried to steal a mobile phone. Apprehended just 2 days after the brutal double murder, Walls was initially convicted and sentenced to death in 1988 for the murders of Alger and Peterson, but this was overturned on appeal. Walls was tried again and in 1992 was reconvicted and sentenced to death, and with irrefutable DNA evidence linking him to the murder scene in the home of Audrey Gidgey, Walls pled no contest to further murder charges. Frank Athen Walls was executed at Union Correctional Institution in Florida, having been on death row since 1992, and this marks the state's 19th execution in 2025 and the largest since the death penalty was introduced. Thanks for reaching the end of the video. Just wishing you all a very happy new year, and we will see you in 2026 for 2 videos publishing every single week.